forgotten tales from Korea's frozen hell. It is not in the grand collisions of armies, nor in the celebrated pronouncements of statesmen, that history reveals its most unsettling truths. The great clashes of empires and ideologies are but the visible tremors of deeper, more intimate quakes within the human mind. We look to the maps, to the treaties, to the recorded speeches, and believe we understand the forces that shape our world. We trace the lines of advance and retreat, tally the casualties, and assign to them a cold, numerical finality. But the most profound conflicts are not fought on the battlefield. They are waged in the silent, isolated landscapes of the soul, where duty wrestles with doubt, and reason stands on the precipice of the unknown. There are moments in the historical record that defy easy explanation, moments that whisper something beyond the accepted narrative. These are the quiet anomalies, the footnotes in the grand chronicle that, if examined too closely, threaten to unravel the entire tapestry. They are the stories of men and women pushed to the absolute limits of their endurance, who, in the crucible of isolation and fear, confront mysteries that have no place in the rational order of the world. This is one such story. It is a story of the Korean War, but not the war you know from the newsreels and the history books. This is a story from the frozen hell of the North, a place where the line between the real and the imagined, between the living and the dead, grew terrifyingly thin. It is the story of the winter soldiers, and of a question that has remained unanswered for over 70 years, a question that speaks not of military strategy or geopolitical maneuvering, but of the enduring power of the human mind to create its own realities, and to be consumed by them. In the winter of 1950, the Korean peninsula was a landscape of frozen misery. The initial successes of the United Nations force had been brutally reversed by the entry of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, and the war had devolved into a bloody stalemate. The front lines, fluid and ill-defined, sneaked through the jagged, snow-choked mountains of the north, a desolate wilderness of granite and pine. Here, in the thin, frigid air, the war was not a matter of grand strategy, but of simple, brutal survival. It was a war against the cold, against starvation, against the gnawing, ever-present fear of an enemy who was as much a part of the landscape as the snow and the shadows. Far from the main lines of engagement, in a sector deemed strategically insignificant, a small, isolated unit of the United States Army was tasked with a peculiar and lonely duty. They were the men of Able Company, 3rd Battalion, 23rd Infantry Regiment, but they were known to the cartographers and the strategists by a different name, Observation Post 73. OP-73 was a lonely speck on the military maps, a cluster of fortified bunkers dug into the crest of a windswept ridge overlooking a vast, empty valley. The valley, known to the locals as the Valley of the Sleeping Ancestors, was a place of ill repute, a place of ancient burial mounds and strange, unsettling legends. The official purpose of OP-73 was to monitor the valley for any signs of enemy movement, a task that was, by all accounts, a fool's errand. The valley was a tactical dead end, a frozen wasteland that offered no strategic advantage to either side. The men of Able Company were, in effect, watching over nothing. Their true purpose, however, was a secret known only to a handful of men, a secret that was as much a product of the Cold War's burgeoning paranoia as it was of military necessity. They were the keepers of a signal, a powerful, experimental radio transmitter that was designed to broadcast a continuous, coded message deep into the heart of Manchuria. The signal was a phantom, a ghost in the machine of the war, a weapon of psychological warfare that was intended to sow confusion and dissent among the Chinese forces. It was a weapon that existed only in the realm of the unseen, a weapon that was as much a product of faith as it was of technology. At the heart of this strange and secret mission was a young officer, First Lieutenant Thomas Callahan. Callahan was a scholar in uniform, a man who had been plucked from the hallowed halls of academia and thrust into the brutal reality of the war. He was a student of history, a man who believed in the power of reason and the clarity of the historical record. He was a man who saw the world in terms of cause and effect, of action and reaction. The war, for him, was a problem to be solved, a complex equation that could be understood and, ultimately, controlled. The signal was his instrument, the tool with which he would impose order on the chaos of the war. He was its keeper, its guardian, the high priest of its invisible power. Callahan was a man of discipline and routine. He oversaw the operation of the transmitter with a meticulous, almost obsessive, attention to detail. He monitored its power levels, its frequency, its coded message, with the same rigor that he had once applied to the study of ancient texts. The signal was a constant in his life, a steady, unwavering pulse in the heart of the frozen wilderness. It was a symbol of order, of purpose, of the rational mind's ability to impose its will on the irrationality of the world. But the valley of the sleeping ancestors, was a place that did not yield easily to the dictates of reason. It was a place of deep, unsettling silence, a silence that seemed to absorb the signal, to swallow it whole. The men of Able Company, a collection of weary, homesick draftees, felt it too. They spoke of it in hushed tones, in the flickering light of their makeshift stoves. They spoke of the silence, of the strange, oppressive weight of it, of the feeling that they were not alone in the valley, that they were being watched by unseen eyes. They were a group of ghosts, haunted by the ghosts of the past. The valley was a place of old, forgotten battles, of ancient sorrows that clung to the frozen earth like frost. The men, their faces gaunt and pale in the winter light, seemed to be fading, to be losing their substance, to be becoming one with the landscape. They moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes vacant, their voices thin and ready. They were the winter soldiers, the forgotten men of a forgotten war, and they were slowly, inexorably, being consumed by the silence. Callahan, in his dogged adherence to reason, dismissed their fears as the product of exhaustion and isolation. He saw their anxieties as a failure of discipline, a weakness of the mind that could be corrected with routine and hard work. He drove them relentlessly, pushing them to their limits, convinced that in the rigor of their duties they would find a bulwark against the encroaching darkness. But the darkness was not so easily dispelled. It was a darkness that came from within, a darkness that was as much a part of them as their own breath. It was the darkness of the human mind, stripped bare of its certainties, confronting the terrifying possibility that the world was not as it seemed. And then came the first of the anomalies, the first of the whispers from the void. It was a subtle thing, a fleeting, almost imperceptible, irregularity in the signal. A flicker, a momentary wavering, a brief, almost inaudible, silence. Callahan, in his obsessive monitoring of the transmitter, was the only one who noticed it. He dismissed it at first as a technical glitch, a minor malfunction in the complex machinery of the transmitter. But the glitches continued, growing more frequently, more pronounced. The signal, his symbol of order and control, was beginning to fail. It was beginning to speak in a new and terrifying language, a language of silence and of doubt. He redoubled his efforts, working feverishly to find the source of the problem. He checked the wiring, the power supply, the intricate network of vacuum tubes and oscillators. He found nothing. The transmitter was, by all accounts, in perfect working order. And yet, the signal continued to falter, to whisper its secrets of the void. The men of Able Company, in their own quiet way, noticed it too. They noticed the change in Callahan, the new, hunted look in his eyes, the way he would stand for hours in the freezing cold, his head cocked, as if listening for something that was just beyond the range of human hearing. They noticed the deepening of the silence, the way it seemed to be pressing in on them, to be suffocating them. And then came the voices. They were faint at first, a mere suggestion of sound, a whisper on the edge of the wind. They seemed to come from the valley, from the ancient burial mounds that dotted the frozen landscape. They were the voices of the dead, the men said, the voices of the ancestors who slept beneath the frozen earth. Callahan, in his desperation, clinging to reason, refused to believe it. He told himself that it was the wind, the play of the frigid air on the rocks and the pines. He told himself that it was a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the stress and isolation. But the voices grew stronger, more distinct. They were not the voices of the dead. They were the voices of the living. They were the voices of men, speaking in a language that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. They were speaking in English, but it was an English that was twisted, distorted, as if it had been passed through a filter of madness and despair. They were the voices of the winter soldiers, the men of able company, but they were not the men that Callahan knew. They were the voices of their doppelgangers, their phantom twins, who walked the valley in the dead of night, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes burning with a cold, unholy light. They were the voices of men who had been consumed by the silence, who had become one with the darkness, who had been reborn as something other, something more than human. Callahan, the scholar, the man of reason, was now confronted with a mystery that defied all rational explanation. He was confronted with the terrifying possibility that the world was not a closed system, that there were forces at play that were beyond the ken of human understanding. He was confronted with the possibility that the signal, his instrument of order, had not been a weapon of psychological warfare, but a beacon, a summons, that had called forth something from the depths of the frozen hell of the north. The unanswered question, the question that had been whispered in the silence of the valley, was now screaming in his mind. What had he awakened? What had he unleashed upon the world? The intellectual ignition had occurred, and the fire, a fire that would consume them all, was now burning out of control. The keeper of the signal had become its prisoner, and the long, dark night of the soul had just begun. The burden of this question fell squarely on Callahan's shoulders. He was the officer, the one charged with maintaining order and morale. He was the scholar, the one who was supposed to have the answers. But the answers he possessed, the ones drawn from the neat, orderly pages of history, were useless here. This was not a problem of logistics or strategy. It was a problem of the mind, a creeping infection of the soul, and it was spreading through his command like a contagion. He saw it in the men's eyes, in the way they would start at the slightest sound, the way they would stare for hours into the empty, snow-filled valley. They were men on the edge, men who were beginning to doubt the evidence of their own senses. He tried to rationalize it, to force the phenomena into a framework that he could understand. The voices, he told himself, were a form of auditory pareidolia, the mind's tendency to find patterns in random noise. The wind, the rustling of the pines, the groaning of the frozen earth, these were the raw materials from which the men's exhausted, frightened minds were constructing a phantom reality. The faltering signal, he reasoned, must be the result of some unforeseen atmospheric conditions, some magnetic anomaly peculiar to this god-forsaken corner of the world. He wrote lengthy, detailed reports to his superiors, reports that were masterpieces of clinical detachment, reports that described the phenomena in precise, scientific terms, but that omitted the one crucial detail, the terror that was slowly, inexorably, consuming him. His superiors, comfortable in their heated bunkers miles from the front, read his reports with a mixture of amusement and concern. They saw in them the classic symptoms of combat fatigue, the strain of a young officer pushed beyond his limits. They sent him encouraging, patronizing replies, urging him to rest, to maintain his perspective, to not let the isolation get the better of him. They promised to send a technical team to inspect the transmitter as soon as the weather permitted, a promise that was as empty as the valley itself. The snow had come early that year, and the passes were all but impassable. OP-73 was on its own. Callahan's isolation was now complete. He was a man trapped in a world of his own making, a world that was becoming increasingly hostile and alien. His faith in reason, the bedrock of his identity, was beginning to crumble. He found himself listening for the voices, straining to hear them, to decipher their meaning. He found himself staring into the valley, searching for the phantom figures that the men whispered about in the dead of night. He was becoming one of them, a winter soldier, a man haunted by the ghosts of the frozen hell. One of the men, a grizzled, world-weary sergeant named Miller, seemed to be less affected by the strangeness than the others. Miller was a career soldier, a man who had seen it all, a man who had no illusions about the nature of war. He was a man of simple, brutal pragmatism, a man who believed in the things he could see and touch. He had little time for Callahan's intellectual agonizing, for his desperate attempts to find a rational explanation for the inexplicable. For Miller, the situation was simple. They were in a bad place, a place that was messing with their heads, and the only thing to do was to keep their heads down, do their jobs, and pray for a transfer. "It's the cold, sir," he would say to Callahan, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It gets into your bones, into your head. Makes you see things, hear things. This place, it's not right. The locals know it. They say the valley is hungry. They say it eats the souls of those who linger too long." Callahan, in his pride, would dismiss Miller's words as superstitious nonsense. But the sergeant's words, for all their simplicity, held a certain undeniable power. They spoke of a truth that was older than reason, a truth that was rooted in the ancient, primal fears of the human heart. The valley was hungry. It was a place that consumed, that devoured, that left nothing behind but an empty, echoing silence. The unanswered question, the question that had been born in the faltering of the signal, was now a roaring in Callahan's ears. It was no longer a question of what he had awakened. It was a question of what was awakening him. The scholar, the man of reason, was dying, and in his place, something new, something terrifying, was being born. The intellectual ignition was complete. The fire was no longer a metaphor. It was a literal, burning reality, a fire that was consuming his mind, his soul, his very being. The keeper of the signal was now its captive, and the long, dark journey into the heart of the frozen hell had truly begun. He began to keep a secret journal, a place where he could record the thoughts and the fears that he could not share with his men, that he could not even admit to himself. The journal was a record of his descent, a chronicle of a rational mind at war with itself. He filled its pages with his observations, his theories, his desperate, frantic attempts to make sense of the senseless. He wrote of the voices, of the phantom figures, of the oppressive, suffocating silence. He wrote of the signal, of the way it seemed to be mocking him, of the way it seemed to be speaking to him in a language that only he could understand. "The signal is a mirror," he wrote one night, his hand trembling so violently that his words were almost illegible. "It is not broadcasting a message. It reflects one. It reflects the darkness that is already here, the darkness that is in the valley, the darkness that is in us. We are ghosts. We are the ones who are hunting this place. We are the winter soldiers, and we are already dead." His words, stark and terrible in the flickering lamplight, were a prophecy, a premonition of the horror that was to come. The intellectual ignition had not just started a fire. It opened a door. And through that door, something ancient and terrible, something that had slept for centuries in the frozen heart of the valley, was now beginning to stir. The unanswered question had become a monstrous, living thing, a thing that was no longer content to whisper in the silence. It was a thing that was about to speak, and its voice would be the voice of madness and of death. The first part of the story of the winter soldiers, was ending. But the real story, the story of the frozen hell and the darkness that it had unleashed, was only just beginning. In the days that followed, the phenomena grew more intense, more undeniable. The voices were no longer whispers on the wind. They were clear, distinct, and they were coming from the radio, from the very instrument that was supposed to be Callahan's symbol of order and control. They were the voices of his men, but they were speaking of things that they could not possibly know, of things that were happening miles away, of things that had not yet happened. They were speaking of the future, of a future that was filled with blood and fire and a darkness that would swallow the world. Callahan, in his last, desperate attempt to cling to reason, tried to convince himself that it was a trick, a sophisticated enemy deception. He imagined a team of Chinese radio operators, hidden somewhere in the valley, who had somehow managed to tap into his frequency, who were using his own men's voices against him. He sent out patrols, small, heavily armed groups of men who were tasked with finding the source of the phantom broadcasts. The patrols returned empty-handed, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with a new and terrible fear. They had found nothing. No tracks, no signs of human habitation, nothing but the endless, silent snow. And then came the disappearances. It started with a young private, a boy from Ohio named Peterson. He was on guard duty one night, a clear, cold night with a full moon that cast long, skeletal shadows across the snow. He was there one moment, and the next, he was gone. There was no struggle, no cry for help, nothing but a single set of footprints that led from his post to the edge of the valley, and then, simply, stopped. It was as if he had been lifted from the earth, plucked from the world by an unseen hand. Callahan, his mind now a maelstrom of fear and confusion, reported the disappearance to his superiors. He described it in his usual, clinical detail, but he could not bring himself to mention the one detail that haunted him the most, the last entry in Peterson's journal, a small, tattered book that he had found lying in the snow near the empty guard post. "I can hear them calling my name," Peterson had written. "The winter soldiers. They say it's time to go home." The disappearance of Private Peterson was the final, shattering blow to Callahan's carefully constructed world of reason and order. The unanswered question was no longer a matter of intellectual curiosity. It was a matter of life and death. The keeper of the signal had failed. He had not only failed to control the darkness, but he had also become its instrument. The signal, his beacon of hope, had become a siren song, luring his men to their doom. The intellectual ignition had led to a conflagration, and the fire was now consuming them all. The first part of the tragedy of the winter soldiers was over. The second, the part that would be written in blood and in madness, was about to begin. The disappearance of Private Peterson marked a turning point at OP 73. The fragile veneer of military discipline, which Callahan had struggled so hard to maintain, began to crack and splinter. The men grew sullen and withdrawn, their conversations reduced to fearful whispers. They moved about their duties with mechanical, listless energy, their eyes constantly scanning the desolate landscape of the valley. The fear was no longer a vague, shapeless anxiety, it had a name and a face. It was the face of a young man from Ohio, a boy who had walked out into the snow and vanished from the face of the earth. Callahan's authority, already tenuous, was now all but gone. The men looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was the officer, the one who was supposed to protect them, but he was as lost and as frightened as they were. His desperate attempts to maintain a semblance of normalcy, to enforce the routines and the regulations that had once been the bedrock of their existence, were met with a quiet, passive resistance. The men would listen to his orders in silence, their faces blank and unreadable, and then they would go about their business in their own slow, deliberate way, as if they were moving through a dream. Only Sergeant Miller seemed immune to the creeping paralysis. He was a rock in the swirling currents of fear and uncertainty, a man who seemed to draw strength from the very bleakness of their situation. He moved among the men with a quiet, confident authority, his presence a silent rebuke to Callahan's ineffectual hand-wringing. He did not offer them false hope or easy answers. He offered them something far more valuable, the simple, unvarnished truth of their predicament. "We're in a bad way, boys," he would say, his voice a low, steady rumble. "But we're not dead yet. We're soldiers. We do our duty. We watch each other's backs. And we don't let the spooks get the better of us." His words, for all their simplicity, had a profound effect on the men. They were a reminder of who they were, of the bonds that held them together in this frozen hell. They were a call to arms, a challenge to the encroaching darkness. The men began to look to Miller, not Callahan, for leadership. They began to see in him the embodiment of their own will to survive, their own stubborn refusal to surrender to the madness that was closing in on them. Callahan, in his isolation, saw this shift in allegiance, and it was another blow to his shattered pride. He resented Miller's easy command, his effortless authority. He saw in the sergeant's pragmatism a rejection of everything he stood for, a rejection of the power of the intellect, of the primacy of reason. He retreated further into himself, into the labyrinth of his own tortured thoughts. He spent his days and nights in the radio bunker, poring over his secret journal, listening to the phantom voices, trying to find the key, the one piece of information that would unlock the mystery of the valley. He began to experiment with the signal, to manipulate its frequency, its power, its coded message. He was no longer trying to control it, he was trying to communicate with it. He was trying to speak to the darkness, to ask it the questions that were burning in his mind. What are you? What do you want? What have you done with my man? The signal, in its new, distorted language, seemed to answer him. The voices grew clearer, more insistent. They were no longer just the voices of his men. They were the voices of others, of strangers, of people who had lived and died in this valley long before the war had ever begun. They were the voices of the ancestors, the ones who slept beneath the frozen earth, and they were telling him a story of a hunger that was as old as the mountains themselves, a hunger that could not be settled. He learned of the winter soldiers, not the phantom doppelgangers of his own men, but the real winter soldiers, the ones who had come to this valley centuries ago, a band of disgraced warriors who had been exiled to this frozen wasteland as a punishment for some terrible crime. They had been left to die, to be consumed by the cold and the silence. But they had not died. They survived. They had made a pact with the valley, with the ancient, hungry spirit that dwelt to its depths. They had offered it their souls in exchange for a kind of immortality, a timeless, deathless existence as the guardians of its solitude. They were the ones who had taken Peterson. They were the ones who were calling to his men, luring them into the valley, to join their ranks, to become part of their eternal, silent watch. The signal, his instrument of modern, rational warfare, had inadvertently tapped into their ancient power, had amplified their call, had given them a voice that could reach through the centuries. This revelation, this terrible, impossible truth, was the final, shattering blow to Callahan's sanity. The world of reason, the world of cause and effect, the world of history, was gone. In its place was a world of myth and legend, a world of ancient, primal forces that were beyond the comprehension of the modern mind. The scholar was dead. The man of reason was no more. In his place was a new kind of man, a man who had investigated the abyss and had seen the abyss look back into him. He was no longer the keeper of the signal. He was its prophet. He was the one who had been chosen to bear witness to the truth of the valley, the truth of the winter soldiers, the truth of the darkness that was waiting to reclaim the world. He tried to warn his men, to tell them what he had learned. He gathered them in the mess tent, his eyes burning with a new, feverish intensity. He spoke to them about the winter soldiers, of the ancient pact, of the hunger of the valley. He pleaded with them to resist the call, to hold fast to their own souls, to not let the darkness consume them. The men listened in silence, their faces a mixture of fear and pity. They saw not a prophet, but a madman. They saw a young officer who had finally, irrevocably, cracked under pressure. They saw a man who was more to be pitied than feared, a man who had become another casualty of the frozen hell. Miller, in his quiet, pragmatic way, tried to intervene. He tried to calm Callahan, to lead him away, to get him to rest. But Callahan would not be silent. He was a man possessed, a man driven by a truth that was too terrible to be borne alone. He broke away from Miller, his voice rising to a frantic, desperate scream. "Don't you see?" he cried, his words echoing in the sudden, shocked silence of the tent. "It's not the war that's trying to kill us. It's the valley. It's the land itself. We're not soldiers. We're a sacrifice." His words hung in the frigid air, a prophecy of doom, a declaration of a war that was far older and far more terrible than the one they had been sent to fight. The men stared at him, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering lamplight. They did not understand his words, not yet. But they understood the terror that was behind them. They understood that the line between the real and the imagined, between the living and the dead, had been crossed. They understood that they were no longer just fighting a war. They were fighting for their very souls. The first part of the story of the intellectual ignition, was over. The second part, the story of the deep immersion into the heart of madness, was about to begin. The aftermath of Callahan's outburst was a profound and unsettling silence. The men retreated into themselves, the fragile bonds of camaraderie shattered by the spectacle of their commanding officer's descent into madness. They avoided him, their eyes darting away whenever he approached. He was no longer their leader, he was an object of fear and pity, a living embodiment of the very forces they were struggling to deny. He was a ghost in his own command, a man who was already lost to the world of the living. Callahan, for his part, seemed oblivious to their rejection. He was a man on a mission, a man driven by a terrible and urgent purpose. He spent his days and nights in the radio bunker, a wild, unkempt figure hunched over the glowing dials of the transmitter. He had abandoned all pretense of military duty, of the routines and the regulations that had once been the scaffolding of his existence. He was engaged in a new kind of war, a war of the mind, a war against an enemy that was as old as the mountains themselves. He filled his journal with frantic, sprawling entries, a chaotic jumble of historical references, scientific theories, and mystical speculations. He drew maps of the valley, not the topographical maps of the military, but maps of the soul, maps that charted the currents of an unseen world. He transcribed the voices from the radio, filling page after page with their strange, disjointed pronouncements. He was no longer a scholar, he was a scribe, a medium, a man who was channeling the voice of the valley itself. Miller watched this transformation with a growing sense of dread. He saw in Callahan a man who was being consumed by a fire of his own making, a man who was being devoured by the very mystery he was trying to solve. He tried to reach him, to pull him back from the brink, but it was like trying to reason with a storm. Callahan was beyond the reach of logic, beyond the reach of human comfort. He was a man who had crossed over into another world, a world where the rules of reason no longer applied. The sergeant's pragmatism, his simple, unshakable belief in the tangible world, was now being tested as never before. He could not deny the evidence of his own senses. He had heard the voices. He had seen the fear in the men's eyes. He had felt the oppressive, suffocating presence of the valley. But he refused to surrender to it. He refused to believe in the ghosts and the spirits and the ancient curses that Callahan was now babbling about. There had to be a rational explanation, a logical solution. There had to be a way to fight back. He gathered the few men who still seemed to have their wits about them, a small, tight-lipped group of veterans who had seen too much to be easily spooked. He spoke to them in low, urgent tones, his voice a beacon of sanity in the encroaching madness. "The lieutenant's gone," he said, his words blunt and uncompromising. "He's not in command anymore. We are. We're going to get through this. We're going to hold this position until we're relieved. And we're not going to let this place get the better of us." He organized the men into a new, more vigilant defensive posture. He doubled the guards, established a system of regular check-ins, and ordered the men to travel in pairs, even within the confines of the outpost. He was treating the situation as he would any other military threat, with discipline, with vigilance, with a stubborn refusal to be intimidated. He was fighting a war against an enemy he could not see, an enemy that was as much a part of his own men's minds as it was of the valley itself. But the enemy was not so easily defeated. The voices grew more insistent, more personal. They whispered to the men in their sleep, calling them by name, speaking of their homes, their families, their deepest fears and desires. They were a siren song of despair, a constant, insidious temptation to surrender, to let go, to walk out into the snow and be done with it all. And then came the second disappearance. It was a young corporal, a boy from Brooklyn named Diaz. He was one of Miller's men, one of the ones who had seemed to be holding it together. He was on watch with his partner, a quiet, steady man from the mountains of West Virginia. They were talking, laughing, trying to keep their spirits up in the face of the encroaching darkness. And then, in the space of a heartbeat, Diaz was gone. One moment he was there, his breath a white plume in the frigid air, and the next, he was gone. His partner, his face a mask of disbelief and terror, swore that he had not seen or heard a thing. It was as if Diaz had simply evaporated. The disappearance of Corporal Diaz was a devastating blow to Miller's fragile authority. It was a direct challenge to his pragmatic, non-nonsense approach. It was a clear and terrifying message from the valley: your rules, your discipline, your vigilance, are useless here. We can take who we want, when we want. You are powerless to stop us. The men were now on the verge of open mutiny. They were trapped in a frozen hell with a madman for a commanding officer and a sergeant who was as powerless as they were. They were being picked off, one, by an enemy they could not see, an enemy they could not fight. They were no longer soldiers, they were prey. The first part of their ordeal, the part that had begun with a flicker in a radio signal, was now reaching its terrible, inevitable conclusion. The intellectual ignition had become a raging inferno, and the flames were now consuming them all. The unanswered question had become a death sentence, and the executioner was the valley itself. The time for questions was over. The time for survival had begun. The disappearance of Corporal Diaz plunged OP-73 into a new depth of despair. The fragile semblance of order that Sergeant Miller had managed to impose was shattered. The men were no longer just frightened, they were openly terrified. They huddled together in their bunkers, their faces pale and gaunt in the flickering lamplight, their eyes wide with primal, animal fear. They were men who had been pushed to the absolute limit of their endurance, and now, that limit had been breached. The valley, which had once been merely a desolate, wind-swept landscape, was now a living, breathing entity, a malevolent presence that was actively hunting them. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with a terrible, unspoken threat. The snow was no longer just frozen water, it was a shroud, a winding sheet that was slowly, inexorably, covering them all. Callahan, in his madness, seemed to be the only one who was not afraid. He greeted the news of Diaz's disappearance with a strange, almost beatific calm. "He's with them now," he said, his voice a soft, dreamy whisper. "He's one of the winter soldiers. He's found his peace." His words, which should have been comforting, were instead profoundly disturbing. They were the words of a man who had not just accepted the horror of their situation, but had embraced it, had made it his own. He had become the high priest of a new and terrible religion, a religion of silence and of snow, of ancient sorrows and of a hunger that could not be sated. His radio bunker was his temple, the transmitter his altar, the phantom voices his choir. He had found his purpose, his calling, in the heart of the frozen hell. He was no longer a soldier of the United States Army, he was a soldier of the valley, a servant of the darkness that dwelt in its depths. Miller, his pragmatism now a useless, shattered tool, was a man adrift. He had no answers, no solutions, no way to fight an enemy that was not just unseen, but was perhaps not even real. He was a man of action, a man who believed in the simple, brutal logic of the battlefield. But this was not a battlefield. This was a place where the laws of logic, of cause and effect, of life and death, had been suspended. This was a place where the only reality was the reality of the mind, and the minds of his men were now a landscape of terror and of madness. He tried to hold them together, to keep them from succumbing to the creeping paralysis of fear. He talked to them, he listened to them, he shared their meager rations and their dwindling hopes. He was no longer their sergeant, he was their confessor, their father, their brother in arms. He was the last bastion of sanity in a world that had gone insane, the last flickering candle in a storm of darkness. But the darkness was too strong, the storm too powerful. The men were slipping away from him, one by one, not in body, but in spirit. They were retreating into the silent, frozen landscapes of their own minds, into a place where he could not follow. They were becoming winter soldiers, not in the way that Callahan meant, but in a way that was just as terrible. They were becoming men of ice and of snow, their hearts frozen, their souls numb. And then, the signal, the source of all their woes, the instrument of their damnation, fell silent. It was not the faltering, intermittent silence of before. It was a complete and utter silence, a dead, flat, absolute void. The transmitter, which had been the one constant in their lives, the one link to the outside world, was now as dead as the valley itself. Callahan, in his temple, his radio bunker, was inconsolable. He worked feverishly to bring the transmitter back to life, his hands raw and bleeding, his face a mask of frantic, desperate concentration. He was a priest whose God had abandoned him, a prophet whose voice had been silenced. The voices, his guides, his companions in the darkness, were gone. He was alone, truly alone, for the first time since he had come to this God-forsaken place. The silence of the transmitter was a new and terrible kind of torture. It was a silence that was not empty, but was filled with a terrible, unspoken question. Had he been wrong? Had it all been a delusion, a product of his own unraveling mind? Had he sacrificed his men, his sanity, his very soul, for a phantom, for a ghost in the machine? This new doubt, this new uncertainty, was more terrifying than any of the horrors he had faced before. It was the ultimate horror, the horror of the void, the horror of a world without meaning, without purpose, without a God. The intellectual ignition, the fire that had consumed him, had now burned itself out, leaving behind nothing but the cold, dead ashes of a shattered mind. The first part of the story of the Winter Soldiers was now complete. It was a story that had begun with a question that had been born in the flicker of a radio signal. It was a story that had ended with a silence that was more terrible than any answer. The keeper of the signal had become its victim, and the long, dark night of the soul was now absolute. The stage was set for the final act of the tragedy, an act that would be written not in words, but in blood, an act that would reveal the final, terrible truth of the frozen hell and the darkness that it had unleashed upon the world. Callahan's obsession with the signal was a source of both fascination and concern for his men. They would watch him in the radio bunker, a solitary figure hunched over the glowing dials, his face illuminated by the eerie green light of the oscilloscope. He was a man possessed, a man who seemed to be listening to a music that only he could hear. They respected his intellect, his dedication, his unwavering belief in the importance of their mission. But they also feared him. They feared the intensity of his gaze, the feverish energy that seemed to radiate from him, the sense that he was a man who was walking a tightrope over a very deep and very dark abyss. The first anomaly in the signal, the first flicker in the steady, unwavering pulse of the transmitter, was an event that went unnoticed by everyone except Callahan. But it was an event that changed everything. It was the first crack in the smooth, polished surface of his rational world, the first whisper of a doubt that would soon become a roar. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation for it. But the anomaly persisted, a stubborn, insistent ghost in the machine, a phantom that was mocking his faith in the power of reason. He began to keep a secret log, a record of the signal's behavior, a chronicle of its slow, steady, and terrifying disintegration. The log was a masterpiece of scientific detachment, a collection of precise, clinical observations that betrayed none of the fear that was growing in his heart. But between the lines of his neat, meticulous handwriting, a different story was being told. It was the story of a man who was losing his grip, a man who was being drawn into a mystery that was far deeper and far more terrible than he could have ever imagined. The voices, when they came, were the final, shattering blow to his carefully constructed world of reason and of order. They were not the voices of the enemy. They were not the voices of a trick or a deception. They were the voices of his own men, speaking in a language of madness and of despair. They were the voices of the Winter Soldiers, the phantom twins who walked the valley in the dead of night, and they were calling to him, beckoning to him, inviting him to join them in their silent, eternal kingdom. He was no longer the keeper of the signal. He was its prisoner. He was no longer the master of the machine. He was its slave. The intellectual ignition had occurred, and the fire, a fire that would consume him and his men, was now burning out of control. The first part of the tragedy of the Winter Soldiers was over. The second, the part that would be written in blood and in madness, was about to begin. The men of Able Company were a microcosm of the American Army in Korea, a motley collection of draftees and volunteers, of farm boys and city slickers, of idealists and of cynics. They had been thrown together by the random, indifferent hand of war, and they were bound together by a shared and unspoken fear. They were men who were a long way from home, in a land that was as alien and as hostile as the surface of the moon. They were men who were fighting a war that they did not understand, for a cause that they could not articulate. They were men who were slowly, inexorably, being ground down by the relentless, impersonal machinery of modern warfare. Callahan was an anomaly in this world of simple, brutal pragmatism. He was a man who had come to the war not with a rifle, but with a book. He was a man who believed in the power of ideas, in the ability of the human mind to impose order on the chaos of the world. He saw the war not as a tragedy, but as a problem, a complex, multifaceted problem that could be solved with the right application of logic, of reason, of intellect. The signal was to be his instrument of salvation. It was a weapon that was not of this world, a weapon that was forged not in the fires of a furnace, but in the crucible of the human mind. It was a weapon that would fight the war not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the enemy. It was a weapon that would win the war not with bullets and with bombs, but with ideas, with whispers, with doubts. He had chosen OP-73 as the location for his grand experiment with a scholar's eye for the symbolic. The Valley of the Sleeping Ancestors, a place of ancient myth and of modern warfare, was the perfect stage for his drama of the mind. It was a place where the past and the present, the real and the imagined, the living and the dead, could meet and merge. It was a place where he could prove his theory, his belief, his faith, in the power of the human mind to shape the world in its own image. But the valley was not a passive stage. It was an active participant in the drama. It was a place with a will of its own, a will that was as old and as powerful as the mountains themselves. It was a place that did not yield easily to the dictates of reason, to the ambitions of men. It was a place that had a story of its own to tell, a story that was far older and far more terrible than the story that Callahan was trying to write. The first sign that his story was not the only one being told was silence. It was a silence that was not an absence of noise, but a presence, a palpable entity that seemed to absorb the sound, the light, the very life, out of the world. It was a silence that was a challenge, a rebuke, a warning. It was the silence of a world that was waiting, that was watching, that was judging. And then came the whispers. The whispers that were the voices of the valley, the voices of the ancestors, the voices of the Winter Soldiers. They were the whispers of a story that had been waiting for centuries to be told, a story of hunger that could not be sated, of a sorrow that could not be comforted, of a darkness that could not be contained. Callahan, in his pride, in his faith, in his madness, did not hear the whispers. He heard only the sound of his own voice, the sound of his own story, the sound of his own grand, beautiful, and terrible ambition. He was a man who was deaf to the music of the world, a man who was blind to the beauty and the terror of the unknown. He was a man who was about to learn a lesson that was as old as humanity itself, that the world is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be experienced, that the mind is not a tool for controlling the world, but a vessel for receiving it, and that the most profound and terrifying truths are not the ones that we discover, but the ones that discover us. The weight of command settled on Callahan's shoulders not as a mantle of authority, but as a shroud of isolation. He was set apart from his men not by rank, but by the very nature of his mind. Where they saw a frozen, desolate landscape, he saw a laboratory, a crucible for the testing of his most cherished theories. He was a man who lived in a world of abstractions, of grand, sweeping narratives of historical inevitability. The war, for him, was not a human tragedy, but a fascinating, if brutal, intellectual puzzle. His men, in their simple, earthy pragmatism, were the unwitting subjects of his grand experiment, the raw data from which he hoped to distill a new and profound understanding of the human condition. His fascination with the signal was the ultimate expression of his intellectual arrogance. He saw it as a tool of pure, disembodied reason, a weapon that would transcend the messy, unpredictable, and ultimately irrational realm of human conflict. He envisioned a war that was fought not with bodies, but with minds, a war that was won not by the side with the most guns, but by the side with the most compelling story. He was a poet of propaganda, a philosopher of psychological warfare, a man who believed that he could change the world with a whisper. But the valley was a place that did not listen to whispers. It was a place that had its own story, a story that was written not in words, but in the silent, eternal language of the earth itself. It was a story of a hunger that was as old as the mountains, of a sorrow that was as deep as the snow, of a darkness that was as vast and as empty as the sky. It was a story that was waiting for a listener, a story that was about finding its voice. The first anomaly in the signal was the first word of that story. It was a word that Callahan did not understand, a word that he could not translate, a word that he could not fit into the neat, orderly grammar of his rational world. It was a word that was a challenge, a question, a threat. It was the first sign that he was not the only one who was telling a story in the valley of the sleeping ancestors. He tried to ignore it, to dismiss it, to explain it away. But the word would not be silent. It grew louder, more insistent, more demanding. It was a voice that was coming from the heart of the valley, from the heart of the darkness, from the heart of the mystery that he had so arrogantly, so foolishly, so fatally underestimated. He was a man who had come to the valley to tell a story, and he was about to discover that he was not the author, but the subject. He was a man who had come to the valley to solve a mystery, and he was about to discover that he was the mystery. He was a man who had come to the valley to find the truth, and he was about to discover that the truth was a monster that was about to devour him whole. The silence of the transmitter did not bring peace. It brought a new kind of tension, a new and more intimate form of dread. The voices from the void had been terrifying, but they had also been a distraction, a focal point for the men's fear. Now, in the absolute, unbroken silence, the men were left alone with their own thoughts, and their thoughts were far more terrifying than any phantom voice. They were men who had been stripped of everything that had once defined them, their country, their homes, their very identities. They were nothing more than a collection of frightened, shivering animals, trapped in a cage of ice and snow, waiting for the end. Days bled into nights in a seamless, monotonous gray. The routine that Sergeant Miller had struggled so hard to maintain devolved into a series of meaningless, repetitive motions. The men ate, they slept, they stood their watches, but there was no life in their actions, no spark of purpose. They were automatons, their bodies going through the motions of life, while their minds were lost in a fog of fear and exhaustion. The world had shrunk to the size of their small, fortified outpost, a tiny island of fragile sanity in a vast, indifferent sea of white. This was the deep immersion, the psychological narrowing that is the true horror of prolonged isolation. The outside world, with its cities and its crowds, its loves and its laughter, ceased to be real. It became a distant, half-forgotten dream, a story that they had once been told but could no longer quite believe. The only reality was the cold, the snow, the silence, and the ever-present, gnawing fear. Their minds, once filled with the complex, multifaceted concerns of a civilized life, were now focused on a single, primal imperative: survival. But survival in this place was not a matter of strength or of cunning. It was a matter of endurance, of the ability to withstand the slow, steady, relentless pressure of the silence and the cold. Callahan, in his self-imposed exile in the radio bunker, was undergoing his own form of psychological narrowing. The silence of the transmitter, which had at first been a source of torment, had now become a kind of solace. It was a silence that he could control, a silence that he could shape to his own will. He had lost his God, but he had found a new kind of power in the void. He was the master of silence, the king of the empty spaces. He began to see patterns in the silence, to hear a new kind of music in the static. He believed that the transmitter was still communicating with him, not with words, but with a more subtle, more profound language. He believed that it was showing him the true nature of the valley, the true nature of the winter soldiers, the true nature of the darkness that was waiting to be born. He was no longer a prophet, he was a mystic, a man who had transcended the limitations of the senses and was now communing directly with the soul of the world. His journal entries from this period are a chilling testament to his descent. They are a mixture of lucid, almost scientific, observations and wild, ecstatic pronouncements. He wrote of the symphony of the snow, of the architecture of the ice, of the geometry of fear. He was a man who was seeing the world not as it was, but as a reflection of his own fractured, disintegrating mind. He was a man who was building a new reality for himself, a reality in which he was not a failure, not a madman, but a visionary, a pioneer of the human spirit. Miller, in his own quiet, pragmatic way, was also undergoing a transformation. The disappearance of Diaz had been a brutal, devastating blow, but it had not broken him. It had, instead, hardened him, had forged his will into a weapon of tempered steel. He had abandoned all hope of a rational explanation, of a logical solution. He had accepted the fact that they were in a place where the rules of the world he knew no longer applied. But he had not surrendered. He had, instead, declared a new kind of war, a war against fear itself. He became a shepherd to his flock of lost and frightened men. He moved among them with quiet, tireless energy, his presence a constant, reassuring source of strength. He listened to their fears, he shared their nightmares, he reminded them of the homes and the families that were waiting for them on the other side of the world. He was fighting to keep the flame of their humanity alive in the face of a darkness that was trying to extinguish it. He established a new routine, a routine that was not based on military discipline, but on the simple, human need for connection and for hope. He organized work details, not to maintain the outpost, but to keep the men's hands and minds occupied. He encouraged them to talk, to sing, to tell stories, to do anything that would break the spell of the silence. He was a man who was trying to build a fortress of the human spirit in the heart of the frozen hell. But the fortress was under constant siege. The valley was relentless in its assault. It sent them dreams of home, dreams that were so vivid, so real, that waking up was a kind of death. It sent them whispers on the wind, whispers that sounded like the voices of their loved ones, calling to them from across the sea. It sent them phantoms in the snow, fleeting, half-seen figures that looked like the men they had lost, their faces pale and sorrowful, their eyes pleading for release. It was a war of attrition, a war that was being fought not with bullets and with bombs, but with the subtle, insidious weapons of the mind. And Miller, for all his strength, for all his courage, was beginning to feel the strain. He was a man who was carrying the weight of his entire command on his shoulders, and the weight was becoming unbearable. He was a man who was looking into the abyss, and the abyss was beginning to look back into him. He began to have his own moments of doubt, his own moments of terror. He would wake up in the dead of night, his heart pounding, his body drenched in a cold sweat, with the unshakable feeling that he was not alone in his small, cramped bunker. He would see things in the corner of his eye, fleeting, shadowy movements that would vanish when he turned to look. He would hear things in silence, faint, almost inaudible, whispers that sounded like his own name. He fought it, he resisted it, with all the strength of his pragmatic, no-nonsense soul. He told himself that it was just the strain, the exhaustion, the play of his own overwrought imagination. But the fear was a patient, persistent enemy. It was a seed that had been planted in his mind, and it was beginning to grow, to send its dark, insidious roots into the very core of his being. And so, the two men, the scholar and the soldier, the mystic and the pragmatist, were both, in their own way, being consumed by the valley. Callahan was embracing the darkness, was making it his own, was finding in it a new and terrible kind of freedom. Miller was fighting it, was resisting it, was trying to hold it at bay with the sheer force of his will. But they were both on a journey into the heart of the same mystery, a mystery that was leading them to the same, inevitable destination. They were both on a path that was narrowing, that was closing in on them, that was leading them to a place where the line between the real and the imagined, between the sane and the insane, would be erased forever. The deep immersion was almost complete. The psychological narrowing was almost absolute. The stage was set for the final, terrible act of the tragedy of the winter soldiers. The psychological narrowing was not a sudden event, but a slow, creeping erosion of the self. It was the gradual peeling away of the layers of identity that had been built up over a lifetime, leaving behind only the raw, exposed nerve of a single, primal instinct, the will to survive. But survival in this place was a paradox, for the very act of surviving was a kind of death. It was a death of the spirit, a death of the soul, a death of everything that made a man human. The men of OP-73 were no longer individuals. They were a collective, a single, multi-limbed organism that was bound together by a shared and all-consuming fear. They moved together, they ate together, they slept together, their bodies huddled close for warmth and for the simple, animal comfort of physical contact. They had lost the ability to be alone, for to be alone was to be vulnerable, to be exposed to the full, crushing weight of the silence and the snow. Their conversations, once filled with the boisterous, profane banter of soldiers, were now a series of hushed, fragmented whispers. They spoke of home, of the lives they had left behind, but their words were like the ghosts of a language they had forgotten how to speak. The past was a foreign country, a place they could no longer imagine returning to. The future was a blank, white wall of snow, a canvas on which they could no longer project their hopes and their dreams. Their world had been reduced to the here and now, to the simple, brutal realities of their existence. The cold that seeped into their bones, the hunger that gnawed at their bellies, the fear that coiled in their guts, these were the only things that were real. Everything else was a phantom, a memory, a dream. Even their own bodies had become alien to them. They were gaunt, skeletal figures, their faces etched with the lines of premature old age. Their eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, held a vacant, haunted look, the look of men who had seen too much, who had been pushed too far. They were the living dead, the walking wounded, the casualties of a war that was being fought not on the battlefield, but in the dark, uncharted territories of the human mind. Callahan, in his self-imposed prison, was the cartographer of this new and terrible world. He was mapping its contours, charting its currents, deciphering its strange and terrifying language. He had abandoned the world of men, the world of reason, the world of the living. He had become a citizen of the valley, a native of the frozen hell. He was no longer a man, he was a consciousness, a disembodied intelligence that was floating free in the vast, empty spaces of the silence and the snow. His journal from this period is a document of almost unbearable intensity. It is the record of a mind that is not just breaking down, but is actively, joyfully, ecstatically, deconstructing itself. He wrote of the liberation of the void, of the ecstasy of the abyss, of the beauty of the nothing. He was a man who had found his God in the heart of the darkness, and he was worshipping it with a passion that was both terrifying and sublime. He had come to believe that the winter soldiers were not a threat, but a promise. They were the next stage of human evolution, the next step in the journey of the soul. They were men who had shed the clumsy, cumbersome baggage of the physical body, of the individual ego, and had become one with the eternal, timeless consciousness of the valley. They were not dead, they were transformed. They were not lost, they were found. He saw himself as their prophet, their John the Baptist, the one who had been sent to prepare the way for their coming. He believed that the signal had not been a mistake, but a miracle. It had been the instrument of their resurrection, the trumpet call that had awakened them from their long, silent sleep. And he, Thomas Callahan, the scholar, the man of reason, had been the one who had been chosen to sound that call. This belief, this terrible, beautiful, insane belief, was the source of his new and unshakable serenity. He was no longer afraid. He was no longer tormented. He was a man who had found his purpose, his destiny, in the heart of the frozen hell. He was a man who was waiting, with a patient, joyful anticipation, for his own transformation, for his own entry into the silent, eternal kingdom of the winter soldiers. Miller, the pragmatist, the man of action, was the last holdout against this creeping, insidious madness. He was the last man who still believed in the world of the living, the world of the real. He was the last man who still believed in the possibility of escape, of rescue, of a return to the world of men. But his belief was being eroded, day by day, by the slow, steady, relentless pressure of the valley. He was a man who was holding back the tide with his bare hands, and he was beginning to feel his strength fail. The fear, which he had fought so hard to keep at bay, was now his constant companion. It was a cold, hard knot in his stomach, a tightness in his chest, a ringing in his ears. He began to see them, the winter soldiers. He would catch fleeting glimpses of them at the edge of his vision, tall, shadowy figures standing motionless in the snow, their faces indistinct, their forms wavering like heat haze. He would tell himself that it was just a trick of the light, a product of his own exhausted, overwrought imagination. But he knew, in the deepest, most secret part of his soul, that they were real. He knew that they were watching him, that they were waiting for him, that they were calling him. He resisted their call with all the strength of his stubborn, pragmatic will. He clung to the memory of his life before the war, to the memory of his wife, of his children, of the simple, ordinary world that he had left behind. He used these memories as a shield, as a bulwark against the encroaching darkness. He was a man who was fighting for his life, for his sanity, for his very soul, with the only weapons he had left, the love and the hope that he carried in his heart. And so, the two men, the mystic and the pragmatist, the prophet and the soldier, stood on opposite sides of the great divide, the divide between the world of the living and the world of the dead, between the world of reason and the world of madness. They were the two poles of the human experience, the two extremes of the human condition. And in the silent, frozen heart of the valley, they were about to play out the final, terrible act of a drama that was as old as humanity itself. The deep immersion was complete. The psychological narrowing was absolute. The pressure was building, the fracture was imminent, and the pivotal event, the event that would change everything, was now just a matter of time. The deep immersion into the world of OP-73 was a descent into a shared and private hell. The men, once a collection of individuals with their own histories, their own hopes, their own dreams, were now a single, undifferentiated mass of suffering. They were a chorus of fear, a symphony of despair, a living testament to the power of the valley to erase the human soul. Their days were a monotonous cycle of meaningless tasks, a series of rituals that were performed not out of a sense of duty, but out of a desperate, animalistic need to keep moving, to keep from succumbing to the paralyzing grip of the cold and the silence. They would clear the snow from the pathways between the bunkers, a task that was as futile as it was endless. They would clean their weapons, their hands clumsy and slow in the biting cold, their minds lost in a fog of exhaustion and of dread. They would sit for hours in the mess tent, staring at the empty, echoing space, their faces gaunt and pale in the flickering lamplight. Their nights were even worse. The darkness, which had once been a welcome respite from the harsh, unforgiving glare of the snow, was now a source of a new and more intimate terror. It was a darkness that was filled with whispers, with shadows, with the ghosts of their own deepest fears. They would huddle together in their bunks, their bodies pressed close for warmth and for the simple, primal comfort of another's presence. But there was no comfort to be found. They were as alone in their shared misery as they would have been in the vast, empty expanse of the valley itself. Sleep, when it came, was not a release, but a continuation of their torment. Their dreams were a landscape of a private and terrible hell, a place where the memories of their past lives were twisted into grotesque and terrifying parodies. They would dream of their homes, of their families, of the world they had left behind, but their dreams were always tainted by the cold, the snow, the silence of the valley. They would wake up with a scream on their lips, their hearts pounding, their bodies drenched in a cold sweat, with the unshakable feeling that they had just returned from a journey to the land of the dead. And then there were the phantoms. The winter soldiers, the silent, shadowy figures who walked the valley in the dead of night, were no longer just a rumor, a whisper, a ghost story. They were a real and terrifying presence. The men would see them at the edge of their vision, standing motionless in the snow, their forms wavering like heat haze, their faces indistinct and terrible. They were the silent, eternal audience to their suffering, the cold, indifferent witnesses to their slow, steady, and inexorable disintegration. Callahan, in his temple of madness, was the only one who did not fear the phantoms. He welcomed them. He saw them as his brothers, his comrades, his fellow travelers on the road to a new and glorious enlightenment. He would spend hours in the radio bunker, his eyes closed, his body swaying gently back and forth, as if he were listening to silent, secret music. He was communing with them, he said, learning their secrets, preparing himself for his own transformation. His journal from this period is a document of a mind that has not just embraced the darkness but has become it. He wrote of the symphony of the snow, of the architecture of the ice, of the geometry of fear. He was a man who was seeing the world not as it was, but as a reflection of his own fractured, disintegrating mind. He was a man who was building a new reality for himself, a reality in which he was not a failure, not a madman, but a visionary, a pioneer of the human spirit. Miller, the last bastion of sanity, was a man who was being worn down, eroded, by the slow, steady, relentless pressure of the valley. He was a man who was fighting a losing battle, and he knew it. The fear, which he had fought so hard to keep at bay, was now his constant companion. It was a cold, hard knot in his stomach, a tightness in his chest, a ringing in his ears. He began to doubt the evidence of his own senses. He would see the phantoms, he would hear the whispers, he would feel the cold, oppressive presence of the valley, and he would no longer be sure what was real and what was a product of his own overwrought imagination. He was a man who was losing his grip on the world, a man who was being pulled, slowly, inexorably, into the same abyss that had swallowed his commanding officer. He clung to the memory of his life before the war as a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. He would spend hours staring at the tattered photograph of his wife and children, their smiling faces, a beacon of a world that was now lost to him forever. He would talk to them, his voice a low, hoarse whisper in the dead, empty air of his bunker. He was a man who was trying to hold on to his humanity by the sheer force of his will, by the power of his love, by the strength of his hope. But the valley was a patient, persistent, and powerful enemy. It was a place that had no room for love, for hope, for the fragile, fleeting beauty of the human spirit. It was a place of silence, of snow, of a cold, eternal, and all-consuming emptiness. The deep immersion was complete. The psychological narrowing was absolute. The stage was set for the final, terrible act of the tragedy of the winter soldiers. Deep immersion was a process of subtraction. Each day, another piece of the men's former selves was stripped away, another memory, another hope, another connection to the world they had left behind. They were being hollowed out, emptied, to make room for something else, something that was as cold and as silent and as empty as the valley itself. Their conversations, when they happened at all, were a litany of ghosts. They would talk of their wives, their children, their parents, their friends, but their words were like stones dropped into a bottomless well. The faces of their loved ones, once so clear and so vivid in their minds, were now becoming blurred, indistinct, like old photographs that had been left out in the sun. The voices of their loved ones, once a source of comfort and of strength, were now a faint, distant echo, a sound that was being drowned out by the roar of silence. They were losing their past, and with it, their future. The future, which had once been a landscape of infinite possibility, was now a blank, white wall of snow. They could no longer imagine a life beyond the valley, a life without the cold, hunger, fear. They were trapped in an eternal present, a timeless, changeless, and hopeless now. Their bodies were a mirror of their souls. They were becoming as gaunt and as skeletal as the trees that clawed at the sky. Their skin was as pale and as translucent as snow. Their eyes were as vacant and as lifeless as the frozen, empty expanse of the valley. They were becoming one with the landscape, their bodies slowly, inexorably, turning into the very substance of their prison. And then there were the dreams. The dreams were the worst of it. They were not the chaotic, nonsensical dreams of a normal, healthy mind. They were a series of vivid, hyperrealistic, and terrifyingly coherent narratives. They were stories that were being told to them, stories that were being implanted in their minds, by a force that was as alien as it was intimate. They would dream of the winter soldiers. They would dream of a band of ancient, disgraced warriors, their faces a mask of a sorrow that was as old as the mountains themselves. They would dream of a pact that had been made, a pact of blood and of shadow, a pact that had granted them a kind of immortality, a timeless, deathless existence as the guardians of the valley's solitude. They would dream of hunger, a hunger that was not of the body, but of the soul. It was the hunger of the valley itself, the hunger of a being that had been alone for too long, a being that craved warmth, life, the energy of the human spirit. It was a hunger that could not be stated, a hunger that could only be fed. They would wake up from these dreams with a scream on their lips, their hearts pounding, their bodies drenched in a cold sweat. But the dreams did not end when they awoke. They lingered, like a poison, in their minds, coloring their thoughts, shaping their perceptions, blurring the line between the real and the imagined. They were no longer sure what was real and what was a dream. They were no longer sure if they were men who were dreaming of being winter soldiers, or if they were winter soldiers who were dreaming of being men. They were lost in a labyrinth of their own minds, a labyrinth from which there was no escape. Callahan, in his madness, was the master of this labyrinth. He was the one who held the map, the one who knew the way. He was the one who had surrendered to the dream, who had embraced the nightmare, who had become one with the darkness. He no longer saw the men as his soldiers, as his responsibility, as his burden. He saw them as his acolytes, his disciples, his fellow travelers on the road to a new and glorious enlightenment. He would move among them, his eyes glowing with a soft, hypnotic light, his voice a gentle, seductive whisper. He would talk to them of the beauty of the void, the ecstasy of the abyss, of the freedom of the nothing. He was a serpent in their garden of despair, a tempter who was offering them the one thing they craved above all else, an end to their suffering. And they were listening. They were beginning to believe. They were beginning to see the world through his eyes, to see the beauty in the horror, the hope in the despair, the life in the death. They were beginning to see the winter soldiers not as a threat, but as a promise. They were beginning to see the valley not as a prison, but as a sanctuary. They were beginning to see the end not as a terror, but as a release. Miller, the last holdout, was a man who was watching his flock being led to the slaughter. He was a man who was trying to fight a battle that had already been lost, a battle for the souls of his men. He was a man who was standing alone against a tide of madness, a tide that was about to overwhelm him. He was a man who was being haunted by the ghosts of his own hope. The memory of his wife and children, which had once been his shield, was now his torment. He would see their faces in the snow, he would hear their voices in the wind, and he would be filled with a grief that was so profound, so absolute, that it was a kind of death. He was a man who was being torn apart, a man who was being crucified on the cross of his own love. He was a man who was being forced to choose between two impossible alternatives, to surrender to the madness and find a kind of peace in the oblivion, or to hold on to his sanity and be condemned to a life of eternal, unrelenting, and hopeless suffering. This was the true horror of the deep immersion. It was not the cold, the hunger, the fear. It was the choice. The choice between a life that was a living hell, and a death that was a beautiful, seductive, and all-consuming lie. It was a choice that no man should ever have to make. It was a choice that was the final, terrible, and ultimate expression of the power of the valley. It was a choice that was the prelude to the end. The men's isolation was not just physical, but temporal. Time itself seemed to have lost its meaning in the valley. The days and nights blurred together into a single, endless, and unchanging now. They would wake up, and they would not know if they had slept for an hour or for a week. They would look at their watches, and their hands would seem to be moving in strange, unpredictable patterns, sometimes racing forward, sometimes crawling backward, sometimes stopping altogether. This temporal disorientation was a new and terrifying form of torture. It robbed them of the one thing that had always been a constant in their lives, the steady, predictable, and reassuring march of time. Without time, they had no past, no future, no sense of continuity, no sense of self. They were adrift in a sea of nothingness, a sea that had no shore, no horizon, no end. And then there were the sounds. The sounds that were not sounds, but absences of sound. The sounds were the silence speaking, the silence singing, the silence screaming. They were sounds that were not heard with the ears, but with the mind, sounds that were not vibrations in the air, but vibrations in the soul. They were the sounds of the valley itself, the sounds of a being that was as old as the earth, as vast as the sky, as deep as the abyss. The men would hear these sounds in the dead of night, when the wind had died down and the snow had stopped falling. They would hear them as a low, throbbing hum, a sound that was not so much heard as felt, a sound that was a vibration in the bones, a resonance in the blood. It was a sound that was both a lullaby and a dirge, a sound that was both a promise and a threat, a sound that was both a welcome and a warning. They did not understand the sound. They did not know what it meant. But they knew, in the deepest, most secret part of their souls, that it was a call. It was the call of the valley, the call of the winter soldiers, the call of the darkness that was waiting to claim them. It was a call that was growing louder, more insistent, more demanding, with each passing day. And they were beginning to answer it. Not with words, not with actions, but with a slow, subtle, and terrifying transformation of their very being. They were beginning to lose their humanity, their individuality, their sense of self. They were beginning to become one with the valley, one with the silence, one with the darkness. They were beginning to become winter soldiers. Callahan, in his madness, was the first to complete the transformation. He was no longer a man, but a vessel, a conduit, a medium through which the valley was speaking. He was the voice of silence, the prophet of the void, the herald of the end. He was the one who was showing them the way, the one who was leading them to their destiny, the one who was preparing them for the final, terrible, and beautiful consummation of their journey. Miller, the last man, the last sane man, was the only one who was resisting the call. But his resistance was weakening, his will was failing, his hope was dying. He was a man who was being worn down, eroded, by a force that was as patient and as persistent as the wind, as the snow, as the ice. He was a man who was standing on the edge of the abyss, and the abyss was calling to him in a voice that was as sweet and as seductive as a lover's whisper. He knew that he was losing. He knew that he was going to fall. He knew that he was going to become one of them. But he also knew that he had to keep fighting, that he had to keep resisting, that he had to keep holding on, for as long as he could. Not because he believed that he could win, but because he believed that the fight itself was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that made him human, the only thing that separated him from the darkness. This was the true horror of the deep immersion. It was not the cold, the hunger, the fear. It was the knowledge that the end was inevitable, that the fight was futile, that the darkness was going to win. It was the knowledge that the only choice left was not whether to surrender, but how. It was the knowledge that the only freedom left was the freedom to choose the manner of one's own damnation. The pressure in OP-73 had reached a critical point. It was no longer a slow, creeping erosion, but a palpable, physical force, a weight that pressed down on the men, crushing the air from their lungs, the hope from their hearts. The systems that had sustained them, both internal and external, were beginning to fail. The fragile fortress of routine and discipline that Sergeant Miller had constructed was crumbling, and the men were now exposed to the full, unrelenting fury of the valley. The food was running low. The weekly drops, which had been their one, tenuous link to the outside world, had stopped. The snow had made the passes impassable, and the sky was a constant, impenetrable curtain of gray. They were now living on half rations, a meager, unsatisfying diet of cold crackers and canned meat. The hunger was a constant, gnawing presence, a dull ache in their bellies that mirrored the deeper, more profound ache in their souls. The cold was their other constant companion. The fuel for their small, makeshift stoves was almost gone, and they were now forced to spend their days and nights in a state of perpetual, shivering misery. The cold was not just a physical discomfort, it was a psychological weapon. It seeped into their bones, into their minds, slowing their thoughts, dulling their senses, reducing them to a state of primitive, animalistic torpor. And then there was fear. The fear was the worst of it. It was a living, breathing entity, a predator that stalked them in the silence and the snow. It was a fear that was no longer directed at a specific threat, at the phantom winter soldiers or the unseen enemy. It was a fear of everything, of the silence, of the snow, of the sky, of the very air they breathed. It was the fear of a world that had become alien and hostile, a world that was actively, malevolently, trying to destroy them. This was the fracture, the point at which the human spirit, stretched beyond its limits, begins to break. The men of OP-73 were no longer soldiers. They were not even men. They were a collection of raw, exposed nerves, a symphony of fear and of pain. They were the living embodiment of the pressure that was crushing them, the fracture that was tearing them apart. The conflict between belief and reason, which had been the central drama of the story, was now playing out in its final, terrible act. Callahan, the man of reason, had become the prophet of a new and terrible belief. Miller, the man of simple, pragmatic belief, was now the last, lonely defender of a reason that had been abandoned by the world. Callahan, in his temple of silence, was in a state of ecstatic bliss. The hunger, the cold, the fear, these were no longer a source of suffering for him. They were a form of purification, a way of shedding the last, stubborn vestiges of his humanity. He was becoming one with the valley, with the silence, with the snow. He was a man who was being reborn, and the process was both terrible and beautiful. His journal entries from this period are a testament to his transformation. He no longer wrote of fear or of doubt. He wrote of a new kind of knowledge, a knowledge that was not based on logic or on evidence, but on a direct, intuitive communion with the soul of the world. He wrote of the great cleansing, of the final purification, of the coming of the ice. He was a man who was not just predicting the end of the world, he was celebrating it. Miller, on the other hand, was in a state of living hell. He was a man who was watching his world, his men, his very self, disintegrate before his eyes. He was a man who was fighting a war on two fronts, against the encroaching madness of the valley and against the creeping despair in his own heart. He was a man who was losing, and he knew it. He clung to reason as a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. He tried to find a logical explanation for the inexplicable. He told himself that hunger was causing hallucinations, that the cold was causing delirium, that the fear was causing mass hysteria. He was a man who was trying to build a dam of logic against a tidal wave of madness, and the dam was beginning to crack. The fracture was not just happening to the men, it was happening to the world itself. The laws of physics, of cause and effect, of life and death, seemed to be breaking down. The snow, which had once been a symbol of purity and of peace, was now a symbol of a new and terrible kind of chaos. It fell in strange, unnatural patterns, in spirals and in circles, as if it were being choreographed by an unseen hand. The wind, which had once been a simple, natural force, now whispered in the voices of the dead, in the voices of the men they had lost. The sun, when it rarely appeared, was a pale, sickly yellow, a dying star in a dying sky. The moon, when it was visible, was a blood-red orb, a malevolent eye that stared down at them with a cold, indifferent hatred. The world was becoming a nightmare, a landscape of a fever dream, a place where the impossible was now every day. And then came the final fracture, the final, shattering blow to the last, lingering vestiges of their sanity. It was a sound that was so loud, so powerful, so utterly alien, that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was not the sound of an explosion, not the sound of a storm, not the sound of anything that they had ever heard before. It was a sound that was both a scream and a song, a sound that was both a lament and a celebration, a sound that was both the beginning and the end of the world. The sound came from the valley, from the heart of the frozen hell. It was the sound of the valley awakening, of the darkness stirring, of the winter soldiers rising from their long, silent sleep. It was the sound of the pressure reaching its breaking point, of the fracture becoming a chasm, of the world tearing itself apart. The men of OP-73, what was left of them, responded to the sound with a collective, primal scream of terror. They were no longer men, they were animals, cornered and terrified, with no place to run, no place to hide. They were at the mercy of a force that was beyond their comprehension, a force that was about to consume them all. Callahan, in his bunker, heard the sound and he smiled. He had been waiting for this. He had been praying for this. This was the culmination of all his hopes, all his dreams, all his mad, beautiful, terrible beliefs. This was the sound of his God, and it was calling him home. Miller, in his own small, cramped bunker, heard the sound and he knew that the end had come. He had fought, he had resisted, he had held on to his reason, to his humanity, with all the strength of his stubborn, pragmatic soul. But he had lost. The valley had won. The darkness had triumphed. He took out the small, tattered photograph of his wife and children that he carried in his breast pocket. He looked at their smiling faces, at their bright, hopeful eyes, and he wept. He wept for them, for the life he had lost, for the world that was now gone forever. He wept for his men, for the good soldiers who had been sacrificed on the altar of a madman's dream. And he wept for himself, for the man he had once been, for the soul that he was about to lose. The pressure had done its work. The fracture was complete. The systems had failed. The belief had triumphed over the reason. The stage was now set for the pivotal event, the event that would be the final, terrible punctuation mark on the story of the winter soldiers. The long, dark night was almost over. The dawn, a dawn of ice and of fire, of madness and of death, was about to break. The fracture of OP-73 was not a clean break, but a splintering, a shattering into 1,000 tiny, jagged pieces. The systems that had held them together, the delicate, invisible threads of trust, of loyalty, of shared purpose, were now all broken. The men were no longer a unit, they were a collection of isolated, terrified individuals, each trapped in his own private and terrible hell. Hunger was a physical manifestation of their spiritual emptiness. It was a gnawing, insatiable craving that was not just for food, but for meaning, for purpose, for a reason to go on living. They would chew on their leather belts, on the bark of the pine trees, on anything that would give them the illusion of sustenance. But there was no sustenance to be found. They were being consumed from within, devoured by a hunger that was as old as the valley itself. The cold was a physical manifestation of their emotional numbness. It was a creeping, insidious paralysis that was not just in their bodies, but in their souls. They would sit for hours without moving, their eyes vacant, their faces blank, their minds lost in a fog of apathy and of despair. They were men who had forgotten how to feel, who had forgotten how to care, who had forgotten how to be human. The fear was a physical manifestation of their spiritual damnation. It was a constant, throbbing presence, a drumbeat of terror that was the only music left in their silent, empty world. They were afraid of everything, of the shadows, of the whispers, of the phantoms, of the very air they breathed. But most of all, they were afraid of themselves. They were afraid of the darkness that was growing within them, the darkness that was turning them into the very monsters that they had once feared. Callahan, in his madness, was the only one who was not afraid. He had embraced the darkness, had made it his own, had found in it a new and terrible kind of freedom. He was no longer a man, he was a force of nature, a whirlwind of ecstatic, destructive energy. He would dance in the snow, his arms outstretched, his face turned up to the dying, sickly sun, his voice a wild, ululating cry that was both a song of praise and a howl of despair. His journal from this period is a document of a mind that has not just been broken but has been reborn. He wrote of the sacred geometry of the snowflake, of the divine music of the avalanche, of the terrible beauty of the void. He was a man who was seeing the world not as it was, but as a reflection of his own fractured, disintegrating, and yet, strangely, integrated, mind. He was a man who had found his God in the heart of the darkness, and he was worshipping it with a passion that was both terrifying and sublime. Miller, the last sane man, was a man who was being crucified on the cross of his own reason. He was a man who was trying to hold on to a world that no longer existed, a world of logic, of order, of meaning. He was a man who was trying to fight a war that had already been lost, a war against an enemy that was not just unseen, but was perhaps not even real. He would argue with the men, his voice a hoarse, desperate plea for a reason that they could no longer hear. He would try to organize them, to discipline them, to remind them of the soldiers that they had once been. But it was like trying to reason with the dead. They would look at him with their vacant, haunted eyes, their faces blank and uncomprehending, and they would not see a leader, a sergeant, a brother in arms. They would see only another ghost, another phantom, another voice in the storm of their own madness. And then came the sound. The sound that was the final, shattering blow to the last, lingering vestiges of their sanity. It was a sound that was not of this earth, a sound that was a violation of all the known laws of physics, of nature, of God. It was a sound that was the voice of the valley itself, the voice of the darkness, the voice of the end of the world. It was a sound that was a physical presence, a wave of pure, raw, and unadulterated power that swept through the outpost, shattering the windows of the bunkers, knocking the men from their feet, tearing the very air from their lungs. It was a sound that was a physical manifestation of the pressure that had been building for so long, the fracture that had finally, and irrevocably, occurred. In the aftermath of the sound, there was a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of completion. It was the silence of a world that had been wiped clean, a world that had been returned to its original, primal state of nothingness. It was the silence of the void. The pivotal event, the final, terrible consummation of the mystery of the winter soldiers, was now at hand. The long, dark night was over. The dawn, a dawn of ice and of fire, of madness and of death, was about to break. The fracture was a sound, a sight, and a feeling. It was the cracking of a glacier, the groaning of a dying world. It was the sight of the sky turning a bruised, sickly purple, of the snow turning the color of ash. It was the feeling of the ground trembling beneath their feet, of the air growing thin and sharp and cold, as if all the warmth, all the life, was being sucked out of the world. The men, what was left of them, reacted to the fracture with a final, convulsive spasm of terror. They ran from their bunkers, their faces contorted into masks of a primal, animalistic fear. They ran without direction, without purpose, their bodies driven by a blind, instinctual need to escape the inescapable. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, and then they fell, one by one, into the soft, yielding, and all-consuming snow. They did not die. They did not lose consciousness. They simply stopped. They lay there, their bodies half buried in the snow, their eyes wide and staring, their minds blank, white, and silent, canvas. They were no longer men, they were statues, monuments to a fear that was so profound, so absolute, that it had transcended the limits of the human mind and had become a kind of peace. Callahan, in his madness, saw the fracture as a sign, a portent, a miracle. He saw it as the birth of his new world, the death of the old. He stood in the doorway of his radio bunker, his arms outstretched, his face turned up to the bruised, sickly sky, and he laughed. It was a laugh that was not of this earth, a laugh that was a mixture of a child's joy and a madman's glee, a laugh that was the anthem of his new and terrible kingdom. He saw the men lying in the snow, and he did not see his soldiers, his comrades, his responsibility. He saw his first converts, his first citizens, his first children. He saw the seeds of his new race, a race of men who had shed the clumsy, cumbersome baggage of the physical body, of the individual ego, and had become one with the eternal, timeless consciousness of the valley. He saw the future, and it was beautiful. Miller, the last man, the last sane man, saw the fracture as the end. He saw it as the final, irrefutable proof that the world he had known, the world he had fought for, the world he had loved, was gone. He saw it as the triumph of the darkness, the victory of the void. He did not run. He did not scream. He did not fall. He simply stood there, a small, insignificant, and yet, strangely, monumental, figure during the storm. He stood there, and he watched the world die. He saw the sky, and he saw not a color, but an absence of color, a void that was sucking the light, life, the very meaning, out of the world. He saw the snow, and he saw not a substance, but an absence of substance, a nothingness that was covering the world in a shroud of its own emptiness. He saw the men, and he saw not his soldiers, but an absence of men, a collection of empty, hollow, and soulless shells. He was a man who was looking at the face of God, and the face of God was a skull. He was a man who was looking at the truth of the universe, and the truth of the universe was a void. He was a man who was looking at the end of all things, and the end of all things was a silence. And in that silence, he found a strange, unexpected, and terrible kind of peace. He had fought, he had struggled, he had hoped, he had loved. He had done all that a man could do. And he had failed. And in that failure, he found a kind of freedom. He was free from the burden of hope, from the tyranny of love, from the illusion of meaning. He was free to be what he had always been, what they had always been, a small, insignificant, and fleeting spark in the vast, eternal, and all-consuming darkness. He closed his eyes, and he waited for the end. He waited for the silence to take him, for the darkness to consume him, for the void to make him its own. He waited for the pivotal event, the final, terrible, and beautiful consummation of the mystery of the winter soldiers. He waited for the moment when he, too, would become a part of the great, silent, and eternal story of the valley. He waited for the moment when he, too, would become a winter soldier. The great, unearthly sound, having torn through the fabric of their reality, faded as abruptly as it had begun. It left behind a silence that was heavier, more profound, than any that had come before. It was not an absence of noise, but a presence, a palpable entity that filled the air, the bunkers, the very marrow of the men's bones. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting for a final, terrible consummation. The pivotal event, when it came, was not the cataclysm the sound had seemed to promise. There was no spectacle, no grand, theatrical explosion of violence. There was only a quiet, insidious unraveling, a slow, almost imperceptible, fading away. It was a failure not of arms, but of presence, a disappearance not of bodies, but of the very idea of them. In the aftermath of the sound, the remaining men of able company simply ceased to be. It did not happen all at once. It was a gradual process, a slow, silent exodus that went largely unnoticed in the fog of fear and exhaustion that now enveloped the outpost. One by one, they slipped away, not into the snow, but into silence. They would be there one moment, a huddle, shivering form in the corner of a bunker, and the next, they would be gone. There was no sign of struggle, no cry for help, no footprints leading away into the valley. There was only an empty space, a sudden, inexplicable void where a man had once been. Sergeant Miller, the last sentinel of a dying world, was the only one who seemed to register their passing. He would move through the bunkers, his face a mask of grim, exhausted determination, taking a silent, desperate roll call. He would see the empty spaces, the places where his men had been, and a new, deeper layer of ice would form around his heart. He did not understand what was happening. He did not know where they were going. He only knew that he was losing them, that they were being taken from him, one by one, by a force that he could not see, a force that he could not fight. He was the last man standing, the last sane man in a world that had gone mad. But his sanity was a fragile, flickering flame in a hurricane of darkness. He was a man who was being haunted not by ghosts, but by absences, by the silent, screaming voids that were opening all around him. He was a man who was being erased, piece by piece, by the slow, steady, relentless pressure of the silence. His war was no longer against the valley, or the winter soldiers, or the madness of his commanding officer. His war was against silence itself. He fought it with the only weapons he had left, his voice, his memory, his stubborn, indomitable will. He would talk to himself, his voice a low, hoarse whisper in the dead, empty air of the bunkers. He would recite the names of his men, the names of his wife and children, the names of the streets of his hometown. He was a man who was trying to hold on to the world by naming it, by speaking it into existence. But the silence was a patient, persistent enemy. It absorbed his words, it swallowed his memories, it eroded his will. It was a slow, creeping tide that was rising all around him, and he was a man who was drowning in a sea of nothingness. And then, there was only one other left, Callahan. The lieutenant remained in his radio bunker, a wild, emaciated figure who had seemingly transcended the physical world. He no longer ate, he no longer slept. He simply sat, his eyes fixed on the dead, silent transmitter, a faint, beatific smile on his face. He was a man who was waiting for the final, glorious consummation of his faith. Miller, in his final act of duty, his final, desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of the world he had lost, went to confront him. He pushed open the door of the radio bunker and stepped into the small, cramped space. The air was thick with the smell of ozone layer and of something else, something that he could not quite identify, something that smelled like the earth after a lightning strike, like the air after a fever dream. Callahan did not seem to notice him. He was lost in his own world, his own private rapture. Miller stood before him, a gaunt, skeletal figure in a tattered, filthy uniform, his face a roadmap of a private and terrible hell. He looked at the man who had been his commanding officer, the man who had led them into this abyss, and he felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, not even hatred. He felt only a vast, empty, bottomless weariness. "It's over, Lieutenant," he said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "They're all gone." Callahan turned his head slowly, his eyes, which had once been so bright with the fire of intellect, now held a strange, milky, opalescent sheen. They were the eyes of a man who was looking at something that was not there, something that was beyond the veil of the visible world. "Gone," he said, his voice a soft, melodious whisper. "No, Sergeant. They are not gone. They are here. They are all here. They are with me. They are with us." He gestured with a thin, skeletal hand to the empty spaces in the bunker, to the shadows that danced in the flickering lamplight. "Can't you see them?" he said, his voice filled with a gentle, chiding wonder. "They are so beautiful. They are so free." Miller looked at the empty spaces, at the dancing shadows, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought he could see them. He thought he could see the faces of his men, of Peterson, of Diaz, of all the others who had been taken. They were smiling, their faces filled with a strange, serene, unearthly light. They were beckoning to him, calling to him, inviting him to join them in their silent, eternal kingdom. He shook his head, a violent, convulsive movement that was a rejection of everything he was seeing, everything he was feeling. He was a man who was standing on the precipice of the abyss, and the abyss was calling to him in the sweet, seductive voice of his own deepest desires. "No," he said, his voice a strangled, desperate cry. "They are not here. They are dead. You killed them. You and your goddamned signal, you and your goddamned valley, you and your goddamned winter soldiers." Callahan's smile did not falter. It was a smile of infinite, compassionate sadness. "You still don't understand, do you, Sergeant?" he said, his voice a soft, gentle sigh. "There is no death. There is only transformation. There is only the great, beautiful, silent becoming. You are afraid of it, because you are still a man. You are still clinging to the world of flesh, the world of pain, the world of sorrow. But you don't have to be. You can let go. You can be free. He stood up, his tall, skeletal frame unfolding like some strange, nocturnal insect. He moved towards Miller, his arms outstretched, his eyes glowing with a soft, hypnotic light. "Let go, Sergeant," he whispered, his voice a siren song of oblivion. "Let go of the pain. Let go of the fear. Let go of the world. Let us be one. Let us be silent. Let us be free." Miller stood his ground, his body rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. He was a man who was facing his final, ultimate test. He was a man who was being offered a choice between the world of the living and the world of the dead, between the world of reason and the world of madness, between the world of hope and the world of despair. He looked into Callahan's eyes, into the swirling, milky depths of his madness, and he saw the truth. He saw that Callahan was not a prophet, not a mystic, not a visionary. He was a void. He was a black hole that was sucking the life, the light, the very meaning, out of the world. He was the personification of the valley, of the silence, of the nothingness that was waiting to consume them all. And in that moment, Miller knew what he had to do. He was a soldier. He had a duty. He had a mission. It was not to save his men, for they were already lost. It was not to save himself, for he was already damned. It was to do one last, final, desperate thing. It was to make a stand. It was to say no. He did not draw his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a move. He simply stood there, a small, insignificant, mortal man in the face of an ancient, immortal, and all-consuming darkness, and he said the one word that was the only weapon he had left, the one word that was the only thing that separated him from the abyss. "No," he said, his voice quiet but clear and firm and unwavering. And then, the world ended. It was not an explosion. It was not a cataclysm. It was quiet, gentle, almost imperceptible, fading away. The light in the bunker did not go out, it simply ceased to be. The sound of their own breathing, the beating of their own hearts, did not stop, it simply faded into the silence. The world, the solid, tangible, real world that they had known, simply dissolved. There was no pain. There was no fear. There was only a sense of a great, peaceful, and final release. It was the end of the struggle, the end of the suffering, the end of the long, dark night. It was the pivotal event, the disappearance, the failure without spectacle. It was the final, terrible, and beautiful consummation of the mystery of the winter soldiers. It was the moment when the valley, the silence, the darkness, finally, and completely, triumphed. It was the moment when OP-73, and all the men who had been a part of it, simply, and forever, ceased to be. The pivotal event was not an event at all, in the traditional sense of the word. It was not a battle, not an explosion, not a final, dramatic confrontation. It was something far more subtle, far more insidious, far more terrifying. It was a quiet, gentle, and almost imperceptible unraveling of the very fabric of reality. In the dead, absolute silence that followed the great, unearthly sound, the world simply began to come apart. The snow, which had been a solid, tangible thing, began to lose its substance, to become a shimmering, translucent mist. The bunkers, which had been their one, fragile shelter against the storm, began to fade, to become as thin and as insubstantial as a dream. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to be dissolving, to be turning into a soft, yielding, and bottomless mire. And the men were coming apart too. They were not dying, not in the way that a man dies from a bullet or a bayonet. They were dissolving. Their bodies were becoming translucent, their forms wavering like heat haze, their voices fading into the all-consuming silence. They were being erased, piece by piece, by a force that was not just unseen, but was perhaps not even there. Miller, the last man, the last sentinel, was the only one who seemed to be aware of what was happening. He was a man who was watching the world, his very self, disappear before his eyes. He was a man who was being consumed by a nothingness that was as gentle and as peaceful as it was absolute and terrifying. He did not fight it. He did not resist it. He had no strength left to fight, no will left to resist. He was a man who had been worn down, eroded, by a force that was as patient and as persistent as time itself. He was a man who was ready to let go. He closed his eyes, and he saw the faces of his wife and children, their smiles bright and clear and real in the darkness of his mind. He held on to that image, to that memory, as a drowning man holds on to his last, precious breath. It was the one thing that was still real in a world that had become a phantom, a dream, a lie. And then, he let go. He opened his eyes, and he saw Callahan. The lieutenant was standing before him, a tall, skeletal figure who was no longer a man, but a being of pure, radiant light. He was smiling, a smile of infinite, compassionate, and terrible love. "It is time, Sergeant," he said, his voice a music that was both a whisper and a symphony, a sound that was both the beginning and the end of the world. "It is time to come home." He held out his hand, a hand that was no longer made of flesh and of bone, but of starlight and of silence. And Miller, the pragmatist, the soldier, the man who had fought so hard and so long to hold on to the world of the living, took his hand. And then, there was nothing. Nothing but silence. Nothing but snow. Nothing but the valley of the sleeping ancestors, which was now, and forever, at peace. The pivotal event was not a disappearance. It was a consummation. It was not a failure. It was a triumph. It was the final, terrible, and beautiful victory of the winter soldiers. It was the moment when the world of men, the world of reason, the world of hope, finally, and completely, surrendered to the all-consuming, all-encompassing, and all-eternal power of the void. History, in its relentless, forward march, has little time for anomalies. It is a story of grand narratives, of clear-cut victories and defeats, of causes and of effects. It is a story that is written by the victors, by the survivors, by the ones who are left to tell the tale. The stories of the lost, of the vanished, of the ones who simply ceased to be, are relegated to the footnotes, to the margins, to the dusty, forgotten archives of the past. And so it was with Observation Post 73. When the spring thaw finally came, when the snows melted and the passes cleared, a patrol was sent to re-establish contact with the small, isolated unit in the Valley of the Sleeping Ancestors. They found nothing. Not a ruin, not a battlefield, not a sign of a struggle. They found only an empty outpost, a collection of silent, snow-scoured bunkers that were as clean and as sterile as a tomb. The men of Able Company, all of them, were gone. Their weapons were neatly stacked in their racks, their personal belongings were carefully stored in their footlockers, their half-eaten meals were still sitting on their tables. It was as if they had simply walked away. Or had been erased. The official investigation was brief and perfunctory. The army, during a brutal and costly war, had little time or resources to devote to the mystery of a single, insignificant outpost. The official report concluded that the men of OP-73, suffering from the combined effects of isolation, exhaustion, and combat fatigue, had deserted their post. It was a simple, logical, and satisfying explanation. It was an explanation that closed the book on the matter, that allowed the army to move on, that allowed the war to continue. But for the men who had been there, for the soldiers who had walked through the silent, empty bunkers of OP-73, the official explanation was a lie. They had seen the look in the eyes of the men who had been stationed there before the winter. They had heard the stories, the whispers, the rumors of the valley and its strange, unsettling power. They knew that the men of Able Company had not deserted. They knew that they had been taken. The story of OP-73 became a ghost story, a cautionary tale that was told in hushed tones in the barracks and the mess halls along the front. It was a story of a place that was haunted, a place that was cursed, a place that was best avoided. It was a story that was a part of the unofficial history of the war, the history that was written not in the official reports, but in the hearts and the minds of the men who had fought it. And there the matter might have rested, a minor, unresolved mystery in the grand, bloody tapestry of the Korean War. But there was one piece of evidence that did not fit the official narrative, one piece of evidence that whispered of a different, more terrible, truth. It was a journal, a small, leather-bound book that was found in the radio bunker, lying on the table next to the dead, silent transmitter. It was the journal of First Lieutenant Thomas Callahan. The journal was a document of madness. It was a chaotic, sprawling, and often incoherent record of a mind that had been shattered by the pressures of war and of isolation. It was filled with wild, mystical speculations, with frantic, desperate attempts to make sense of the senseless. It was the work of a man who had lost his grip on reality, a man who had been consumed by his own private and terrible hell. And yet, there was something more in the journal. There was a strange, unsettling lucidity in its madness, a chilling, compelling logic in its insanity. It was a document that could be read in two ways. It could be read as the ravings of a madman, a tragic but ultimately meaningless record of a mind's collapse. Or it could be read as something else entirely. It could be read as a literal, factual account of an encounter with the impossible, with a force that was beyond the ken of human understanding. It could be read as a testament, a prophecy, a warning. This is the true legacy of the Winter Soldiers. It is not the story of a military mystery, of a lost unit, of an unsolved case. It is the story of a question that has no answer, a question that has been haunting the margins of history for over 70 years. It is the question of the nature of reality, of the limits of reason, of the power of the human mind to create its own truths, and to be consumed by them. Was Callahan a madman, a victim of his own overwrought imagination? Or was he a prophet, a man who had seen a truth that was too terrible, too beautiful, too profound, for the rest of the world to bear? Were the Winter Soldiers a phantom, a hallucination, a product of a collective, hysterical delusion? Or were they something more, something real, something that is still waiting, in the silent, frozen heart of the valley, for the next signal, for the next call, for the next soul to be harvested? History cannot answer these questions. The record is silent. The evidence is ambiguous. The truth, whatever it may be, is lost to the snows of time. We are left with only the story, the mystery, the unanswered question. We are left to wonder, to speculate, to reflect. We are left to confront the unsettling possibility that the world is not as it seems, that the line between the real and the imagined is not as clear as we would like to believe, that the most profound and terrifying mysteries are not the ones that are out there, in the darkness of the unknown, but the ones that are in here, in the silent, uncharted landscapes of our own minds. What remains is the silence, the echo of a question that cannot be answered. What history cannot fully explain is the human mind's desperate, and sometimes fatal, need to find meaning in the meaningless, to impose order on the chaotic, to find a story in the heart of the storm. The mystery of the Winter Soldiers is not a mystery of what happened to a group of men in a frozen valley so long ago. It is the mystery of what happens to any of us, to all of us, when we are pushed to the absolute limits of our endurance, when we are forced to confront the darkness that lies not in the world, but in ourselves. It is a mystery that reveals that the most unsettling truths are not the ones that are written in history books, but the ones that are whispered in silence, the ones that we carry in our own hearts, the ones that we are all, in our own way, destined to become. If this story has awakened something in you, if it has resonated with the truth in your own heart, then our journey together has just begun. Subscribe to this channel. The mystery of OP-73 is not a mystery that can be solved. It is a mystery that can only be experienced. It is a mystery that invites us to question the very nature of our own reality, to confront the darkness that lies not in the world, but in ourselves. It is a mystery that reminds us that the most profound and terrifying truths are not the ones that are written in the history books, but the ones that are whispered in the silence, the ones that we carry in our own hearts, the ones that we are all, in our own way, destined to become. The story of the Winter Soldiers is not a story of the past. It is a story of the present. It is a story that is happening now, in the silent, frozen landscapes of our own minds. We are all, in our own way, soldiers in a war against darkness, a war against silence, a war against the void. And we are all, in our own way, in danger of becoming winter soldiers ourselves. So listen. Listen to the silence. Listen to the whispers. Listen to ghosts. They are trying to tell you something. They are trying to tell you a secret that is as old as the mountains themselves, a secret that is as deep and as dark and as beautiful as the human soul. They are trying to tell you the story of the winter soldiers. And they are trying to tell you that the story is not over. The story has just begun. The official history of the Korean War is a history of battles, of strategies, of statistics. It is a history of men and of machines, of victories and of defeats. It is a history that is written in the cold, hard, and unforgiving language of fact. But there is another history of the war, a history that is not written in the official reports, a history that is not taught in the military academies, a history that is not remembered in the public monuments. It is the secret history of the war, the history of the things that were seen and not seen, of the things that were heard and not heard, of the things that were felt and not felt. It is the history of ghosts. Every soldier who has ever been to war has a ghost story. It is a story of a premonition, of a vision, of a strange, inexplicable event that defies all rational explanation. It is a story that is told in hushed tones, in the dead of night, in the company of men who have seen too much to disbelieve. It is a story that is a part of the oral tradition of war, a tradition that is as old as war itself. The story of OP-73 is the ghost story of the Korean War. It is the story that is told to the new recruits, the fresh-faced boys who have not yet seen the face of the elephant. It is a story that is meant to scare them, to warn them, to prepare them for the fact that the world is not as it seems, that the war is not just a battle against a human enemy, but a battle against the darkness that lies in the heart of all things. But the story of OP-73 is more than just a ghost story. It is a parable. It is a cautionary tale. It is a meditation on the nature of belief, of reason, of madness, of war. It is a story that asks the most fundamental questions of human experience. What is real? What is true? What is the meaning of it all? Callahan's journal is the sacred text of this parable. It is a document that has been studied, analyzed, and debated by military historians, by psychologists, by philosophers, by theologians. It is a document that has been interpreted in 1,000 different ways, a document that has been used to support 1,000 different theories. It is a document that is a mirror that reflects the beliefs, the biases, the hopes, the fears, of the one who is reading it. Some say that it is the work of a madman, a tragic but ultimately meaningless record of a mind's collapse. They point to the stress of command, the isolation of the outpost, the malnutrition, sleep deprivation, the constant, gnawing fear. They say that these were the ingredients that created the perfect storm in Callahan's mind, a storm that washed away the foundations of his reason and left him at the mercy of his own private and terrible hallucinations. Others say that it is the work of a prophet, a man who was granted a vision of a truth that is hidden from the rest of us. They point to the strange, unsettling coherence of his madness, the chilling, compelling logic of his insanity. They say that he was a man who had pierced the veil of the material world and had seen the face of the divine in all its terrible, beautiful, and all-consuming glory. And still others say that it is something else entirely. They say that it is a work of fiction, a deliberate, calculated, and brilliant hoax. They say that Callahan was not a madman, not a prophet, but a writer, a storyteller, a man who had created a masterpiece of psychological horror, a story that was so powerful, so convincing, that it had not only consumed him, but had also consumed his men. They say that he was a man who had discovered the ultimate weapon of psychological warfare, a weapon that could not only kill the body, but could also kill the soul. But in the end, all of these theories, all of these interpretations, are just stories. They are just attempts to impose a narrative on the chaos, to find a meaning in the meaningless, to find an answer to a question that has no answer. The truth of what happened at OP-73 is lost to the snow of time, to the silence of the valley, to the darkness of the human heart. We are left with only the mystery. We are left with only the question. We are left with only the story. And the story is this, that once upon a time, in a frozen, desolate valley in a forgotten corner of a forgotten war, a group of men were sent to watch over a silence, and the silence watched back. And in that watching, in that silence, in that darkness, they found a truth that was more profound, more terrifying, and more beautiful than any truth that has ever been written in history books. They found the truth of the winter soldiers. And the truth was this, that we are all winter soldiers. We are all guardians of silence. We are all watchers of darkness. And we are all, in our own way, waiting for the signal, for the call, for the moment when we will be asked to choose between the world of living and the world of the dead, between the world of reason and the world of madness, between the world of hope and the world of despair. And in that moment, in that choice, we will discover who we truly are. We will discover if we are men, or if we are ghosts. We will discover if we are the tellers of the story, or if we are the story itself. The legacy of OP-73 is not a legacy of fact, but of folklore. It is a story that has been passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next, a story that has been embellished, exaggerated, and transformed, in the telling. It is a story that has become a part of the mythology of the American Army, a story that is as real and as unreal as the stories of the gods and the heroes of old. In some versions of the story, Callahan is a hero, a man who sacrificed himself and his men to prevent a great evil from being unleashed upon the world. They say that the signal was not a weapon, but a warning that was meant for us, a warning that we have not yet heeded. They say that the winter soldiers are not ghosts, but guardians of a gate that must not be opened. In other versions of the story, Callahan is a villain, a man who, in his arrogance and his ambition, made a pact with the devil. They say that the signal was a summons, a call to a power that was ancient and evil and all-consuming. They say that the winter soldiers are not guardians, but demons that are waiting for the day when they will be unleashed upon the world to feast upon the souls of the living. And in still other versions of the story, there is no hero, no villain, no good, no evil. There is only the valley. There is only silence. There is only darkness. And there is only the choice. The choice between the world of the living and the world of the dead, between the world of reason and the world of madness, between the world of hope and the world of despair. A choice that we all must make, in our own way, in our own time. This is the enduring power of the story of the winter soldiers. It is a story that is not about the past, but about the present. It is a story that is not about them, but about us. It is a story that holds up a mirror to our own souls and asks us the most fundamental questions of our own existence. What do we believe? What do we fear? What do we hope for? And what are we willing to sacrifice for those beliefs, those fears, those hopes? These are the questions that are at the heart of the mystery of OP-73. These are the questions that are at the heart of human experience. And these are the questions that we must all, in the end, answer for ourselves. For we are all, in our own way, soldiers in a war against the darkness. We are all, in our own way, guardians of a silence. And we are all, in our own way, waiting for the signal, for the call, for the moment when we will be asked to choose. And in that moment, in that choice, we will discover who we truly are. We will discover if we are the tellers of the story, or if we are the story itself. Subscribe for weekly historical mysteries and bedtime stories that will challenge your understanding of the past.